And, you've spent more than 3 decades now on Wall Street. You finally left, started your own firm. I'm curious about your end game. What is the ambition here of having a woman-led firm that stands apart from the investment banks you've worked for, Citigroup, JP Morgan, Salomon Brothers?
Thank you for having me, and it's great to be with both of you today. I spent 32 years thinking that I could try to change Wall Street from inside, and very loudly tried to do that. And finally, when I made the decision in December of 2020, post-COVID, to think about the next chapter, I realized I didn't want to leave Wall Street with less diverse people in high-earning seats than in 1990, which is what it felt like from my own experience. And so I saw a clear opportunity that as companies and clients have clearly embraced the ESG movement, it was amazing how little representation there was on the most important advice the clients need around mergers and acquisitions, IPOs, and other strategic transactions.
Now, David, something interesting that many people don't realize about Carlyle, the firm that you co-founded, was that for many years it actually had more women at senior level roles, money managing roles, than most of the industry.
And still.
Yes, still to this day, more than half of Carlyle's assets are managed by women, which you cannot say across the industry. How did that become the case?
Well, I'd like to say it's because I decided that's what I wanted to do. But the reality is, to be honest, we started our firm in Washington, D.C. We didn't start it in New York. And in New York, if you were starting a private equity firm, you would tend to get people from investment banks. Investment banks were not at the cutting edge at the time of, I'd say, gender equality. And so in Washington, while Washington has many problems for sure, we were able to recruit people who were living in Washington, and many of them tended to be people in companies that were not, let's say, as male-oriented as Wall Street. So we were able to get some very talented women. Now, as we expanded to New York and around the rest of the country, we took the same mindset, which is to get the most qualified people we could. And we were fortunate to have more diversity than many of our peers, and I still think we take a lot of pride in the fact that we have more women and more diversity than many of our peers. I don't want to say the others are not doing a good job, but we're pretty proud of what we've done in building out, I'd say, a firm that many people who have diverse backgrounds feel very comfortable at working at.
It's interesting you mentioned the challenges in investment banking, given that's where your background has been for so long. Why did you stick it through? And what were the challenges along the way that may still be there today, frankly?
So it can be the best job in the world, and that's really what I want to inspire, especially young women and diverse candidates who don't have exposure to the industry, to realize that you're working with companies, you're working with very smart people on opportunities that you can read about in the paper or see on Bloomberg TV the next day. That's a very rare privilege, in my opinion. But I think there's also, it's fair to say, the work approach hasn't changed in 40 years. The notion of a 100-page presentation that somebody's working on at 2 in the morning, the world has changed, and I'm excited to be part of thinking about how do you modernize this industry, since advice doesn't have to be conducted in the same way that it was when I started my career in 1989.
Now, look, diversity means many different things to many different people. I'm Jewish, and for a long time, people on Wall Street, many people discriminate against people who were Jewish. There's a different types of diversity that we're talking about. We're talking about now not having religious discrimination, not having gender discrimination, not having sexual preference discrimination, not having ethnic and racial discrimination. It's a sea change that I didn't think when I was younger I would live to see, because for most of organized history, there's been this prejudice against women, certainly, and for people who are in minority status in a given society. And the United States has taken the lead, though a number of Western European countries have done a good job as well, of actually saying, no, we need to hire the most qualified people. And the United States, I think, has done a reasonably good job in recent years in catching up, but we still got a long way to go. There's no doubt that we're not going to be at 50-50 in terms of women and men professionals running money management firms anytime soon. It's still going to take a while. I think you would probably agree with that. It's going to take a while. And if you take a look at the areas that I think the most progress have been made, the law firms probably have made more progress than the investment banks. Investment banks have made more progress than the private equity firms. The private equity firms have made more progress than the hedge funds. I think the hedge funds have made more progress than the venture funds. So there's a long way to go, and I think now we want to be in a situation where It's not a story that a woman is running a major firm, or it's not a story that somebody who is gay or bisexual is running a major firm. You don't want those to be the stories. You want people not to even focus on it. We're still not there yet.
Well, I think one of the reasons I've always been passionate about this is because the financial industry, the center of capital, doesn't look like the community it serves. So what's at risk here if things don't change, given the numbers are so bleak already in terms of the people who are able to access venture funding, private equity funding?
Well, the theory behind, there's one theory is that everybody should be treated equal. And that's a very good theory, part of our Declaration of Independence, although obviously that was written by somebody who didn't really believe in it, perhaps. He had 200 slaves and other things, so he still said that all men are created equal. He didn't say all women are created equal. He said all men are created equal, and he really meant all white Christian male men are created equal. But leaving that aside, what you want to have is a situation where people feel that they represent society. And so and the reason you want to do that is that you're going to be making better decisions. If you have 50% of your customers are women, but you have no women in your decision-making process, how likely are you going to be able to figure out what women really want as their customers? The same thing is true with lots of boards I'm on. A lot of nonprofit boards or corporate boards, I keep saying to them, why don't we have people who are younger? Because there's some discrimination against younger people on boards as well. It's not quite the same as gender discrimination, but when you're selling products for young people or you're dealing with software companies, you should have younger people on the boards because, and the same is true in the nonprofit area, because many of the people who are making decisions to participate in your organization or buy your products are younger, yet very often you see boards looking at sort of like me, white-haired, old white guys.
You know, it's interesting, and you've mentioned this as a supply-side problem as well as a demand issue here. It's not just Wall Street, right? It's everybody. What are the problems on the client side that you can see being fixed?
So I pick up on a couple of the themes that David mentioned. First and foremost, this is a client-driven business, and they're not going to sacrifice exceptional talent. The good news is, in less than 4 months, I've proven that you can have the Venn diagram of exceptional talent that is more than 70% diverse. And so our launch team, who are some of the best trained people on Wall Street, is a representation of working mothers for African Americans, openly out LGBTQ, Hispanic Americans, and Southeast Asian women. And it's not hard to find people if you can create the ecosystem and the opportunity that really allows them to thrive. I think this will ultimately be driven, and the timeline will be driven, by CEO demand. And so I dream of the moment when we are sitting next to a CEO of a major company announcing a big M&A deal, a big IPO, and they voluntarily say, this team, because of their expertise first and foremost, whether that's on ESG, cybersecurity, or the other topics we've invested in, but this team's expertise and the fact that they, to David's point, represent our customers, our stakeholders, they made my decision better. And I think the data is pretty clear that cognitive diversity does lead to better decisions. That moment when the first CEO says, I saw the benefit and I made a better decision, I think that's what drives the pace of change. And we're excited for that to happen really soon.
Now, the pace of change, David, something you had mentioned before, it could take a long time. How long?
Well, we've been at civilization for thousands of years. When you think back on it, it is amazing how rapid the change has occurred in the last 20, 30 years, relatively speaking. So organized, people came out of caves as Homo sapiens 400,000 years ago. And for most of that 400,000 years, men dominated everything, I would say, and majority people, white, let's say in a country like this, dominated things. Now, just in the last, I would say, 30, 40 years or so, you've begun to recognize that actually people who are different, who are diverse, who might be minorities, actually have some incredibly good capabilities, and you're seeing things change dramatically. And it's interesting, take racial equality. We've had slavery. We had slavery for several hundred years. We ended it in 1865, but then with the Jim Crow laws, we had another 100 years of essentially non-slavery, but a terrible situation for African Americans. Thousands of lynchings occurred in the 20th century. It was hard to get the Civil Rights Act in '64, hard to get the Voting Rights Act in '65 passed. But with all those things, we still didn't really have equality. Yet when the George Floyd murder occurred, it's amazing how one murder, and there were so many murders like that before, one murder really galvanized the business community to say we've got to do a much better job. So I think there hasn't been quite an equivalent event with women. Fortunately, there's nothing quite like that. But I think needs to be a galvanizing event that makes it clear to men that actually we have to make even more progress. So how long is it going to take? It's going to take longer than I'm probably going to be around on the planet Earth to have everybody be treated completely equally. We probably are not going to be there quite as quickly as I think we should be, but we've made enormous progress just in the last, I would say, decade or two compared to where we were when you started in Wall Street. When you started in Wall Street, I suspect, and when I was starting Carlyle, there weren't that many women in the financial service world or private equity world, the venture capital world. It's changed dramatically. It's still not where it should be, but it's not going to happen overnight, in my view.
I'm a believer, though, in capitalism. And so when I think about whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, what works on Wall Street are very clear incentives and penalties. And so, and I espoused in the large organizations I was part of, the moment at which a trader loses $500,000 because they can't retain 80% of the diverse people who've been added to their team, or more importantly, the moment when a leader puts forward a woman on the most important transaction and sees a $500,000 benefit, I think capitalism works. Now, it's not happening within the organizations, so where it will happen, the power is with the clients. And the excitement about the rise of stakeholder interest and shareholders being so vocal on this is clients drive the change, and Wall Street always responds to the client demand. And as David said, going through, from bottoms up, from companies to private equity firms to VC firms, I actually think that we're very close to that point where if shareholders can quantify the benefit that they attribute to these firms, you'll see the change.
I think to some extent we're still a little bit in the check the box category. Totally. We want to check the box. We've done diversity. Now we'll go about our business the way we did before, but now we have enough things so we can say we check the box. When we're not quite really in the category of, yes, there is absolutely no discrimination at all and everybody is equal.
And sometimes it's not just blatant discrimination, but a matter of blatant misunderstandings. One story I've given both of you is I walked into an investment bank about 8 years ago, spoke to a president, and he said, there's no place for women here. The reason he said, was because women drop out of the workforce in their 30s. So, I'm curious about what you think about this. This is because they have children and so on and so forth. Both of you have talked about, a workplace environment that can be more conducive to women thriving. So what do you think it is that managers are not understanding about the way that women rise in their own workforces?
Let me give you at least one statistic. So in my entry class at Solomon Brothers in 1989 in investment banking, a class of 25, there were 8 women. Those 8 women are still all working today. They're just not working on Wall Street. And the majority of them had families and proved that you could do that. It's become a little bit of a convenient excuse for both women and men to want to believe that the work-life balance and family is why women leave. In my own opinion, as the mother of a 24-year-old and a 21-year-old, people leave because of lack of opportunity and lack of inclusion and lack of excitement about whether the time they're putting in to their day job is still as fulfilling. And again, those are all things that need to be corrected. One of our core tenets in the company I've launched is I've accepted the reality that people are not going to all want to work in Midtown Manhattan. We have a woman in Bend, Oregon. We have people in Atlanta. We have people in Austin, Texas. Is it hard? Absolutely. But is it the modern reality that that's going to be part of meeting people where they need to be, recognizing they have parents, children, and other demands on their life? That's going to be what it takes to have top talent.
For all of organized history, it's clear that in all societies, women have taken on a greater part of the child-rearing burden than men have. And until that really changes and it's really equal, I don't think you're going to have men looking at women quite the same way as they look at men because of the child-rearing time responsibilities. Women often know that if any of you are women who have children, when you are working, you don't tell your boss, your male boss, I have to go see my baby doctor for my child. I have to go do a school appointment for my child. You make up an excuse. You say, well, I've got to go see a client or something, because you don't want to tell your male boss, actually, I have to do something that's related to child rearing, because I don't want you to think that I am less than 100% committed to the job. And I don't know whether you've had this kind of experience, but you probably see women are trying to hide the fact they're doing child caring things when in fact they shouldn't have to do that, but that's still the reality of the workplace.
Well, we were talking about this as better paternity leave policies as well as maternity leave policies, part of the equation here.
Well, I think we've made a lot of progress in working towards this, but the funny thing about the human brain is that when humans appeared on the face of the earth, you think the elephants were saying, hey, these people are going to dominate society and they're going to take over the world? You think the gorillas were saying, well, these people are going to take over the world? No, because we weren't as fast, we weren't as big, we weren't as strong as the animals they saw. But how do we take over the earth? How do we conquer it? Because the brain was better than anything else anybody else had. But the brain, for all of its incredible ability to produce Shakespeare plays or Picasso works of art or Einstein theories, still has a flaw in it, which says, if I look at you and you don't look like me, I don't like you as much as I like somebody that looks like me. So there's something in the human brain that just says, if you look different than me, I'm not going to treat you the same as somebody who looks like me. And until we change that flaw in the brain, I don't think you're going to ever have perfect equality.
And you put this in such a really interesting way in the frame of risk-taking. The idea that in the last year or so that people have not been willing to take a risk on the people that they don't know. How has that played out?
So I go back and pick up a little bit on one of David's points around authenticity. And the prior speaker, I thought, said it far more eloquently than I ever could. But we need both men and women to come into the job every day as their authentic selves. And David's absolutely right. Women hide the fact that they have child-rearing responsibilities. And what's interesting is I've been out recruiting, especially women, is when a woman says that their child has a soccer game at 10 a.m. on a Saturday and they can't join a conference call, she's actually told by her boss, you really shouldn't have said that. That's the part, and yet the man who says the same thing is celebrated as being the world's best dad. So I move beyond paternity leave. As any mother will tell you, the notion of paternity leave, while it may be a lightning rod issue, it's a defined point of time. And where you really need balance is across the 21 plus years of child rearing, not for a 2-month period where the baby sleeps the majority of the day.
So the dress code is another factor. Women feel they have to dress in an appropriate way to kind of look more like men. So someone once said to me many years ago, bankers don't have toes. In other words, women are not supposed to wear open-toed shoes in a business setting because it doesn't seem appropriate. And maybe it's changed, but women have to dress a certain way to kind of make men think that, at least they feel, make men think that they're comparable to them in the way they look at things. And, they're not really reflecting their personality to some extent because they're trying to adapt to what they think is the male-dominated fashion code.
I wore black the first 6 out of the 8 years of my reporting career on Wall Street for that same reason.
Okay.
I'm wondering also, let's kind of bring it in the vein of the last couple of years here as well. Ann, you and I have also acknowledged and seen so many women leave Wall Street. What have you heard and what are they telling you about this? Is it part of the Great Resignation or is it the lack of the willingness of Wall Street to change?
I think it's a combination of both. I do believe COVID has changed all of us. We all look at our life and say, how do we want to spend the quality time in our life, both with our family, but also professionally? And what do we think will be the imprint that we want to leave when we look behind? And I go back to the 3 words that I use to recruit candidates, and they seem to be working because we're up to 25 people, are aperture. How do people think about, the majority of people on Wall Street sit in a very narrow swim lane that they've sat in for a long time. Certainly a lot of people are saying, I'd like to see something a little bit broader, a little bit different. The second word is opportunity, which is, I was fortunate in the ability to join a corporate board at a point in my career. I learned so much by that difficult decision of letting me experience another company and how they made decisions. And then the final word is transparency. I think people are capitalists. They are willing to work hard where they see what that can produce for their families, and that's gotten just very hard to see in the conventional firms. So you put all of that together, I ultimately think people are not leaving because they don't like the fundamental work. They don't like the setting in which they're being asked to somehow adapt to a world that's adapted, and it hasn't adapted within the four walls.
David, you had mentioned earlier that you saw how this had played out in Washington, you saw how it played out in the law firms and then on Wall Street. When you look around your peers now, do you have more faith in Washington or in corporate America to be a part of the solution for this problem?
Well, that's a Sophie's choice kind of answer. I don't think I can give a good answer without offending somebody that I'm going to see later today, I guess. But look, Washington reflects what the politicians there think the country wants, and so they're pretty good barometers. And I think the country is probably more open to some of these changes politically than maybe some people on Wall Street are. To be honest, Wall Street is a little isolated and insulated from the political pressures, not completely so, but a little bit. So I think Washington probably reflects the country much more than it's supposed to, than Wall Street. Wall Street is not supposed to be a democratic government organization, but I think Wall Street is moving in the right direction. It just moves a little more slowly than I think government does in Washington, D.C.
And do you think, because of that, do you think that D.C. needs to have more oversight on what's happening here? Do you think that there should be more rules, more people watching what's happening in the corporate sector?
So there are two ways to look at it. I think a lot of the progress we've made on diverse representation on corporate boards, I attribute to quotas that started in Europe. There was nobody who would say they wanted a quota in the US, but that external pressure that started in Europe and that came from a variety of different places has made a material difference in diversity on corporate boards. I go back to, I am a believer in capitalism, and I think that there's a way that rules won't lead to the change that's authentic, and I would rather have companies see they're missing exceptional talent, and if we encourage our diverse employees to show up as their authentic selves and actually call out that they're making the conversation a better, different conversation because they're different, I think that's going to lead the best CEOs to realize, why would I want to be missing that? It's a powerful part of making a better decision.
Okay, in any organization, to rise up, you have to adapt to the mores of the organization. That's inevitably the case. But I think increasingly in organizations, people should recognize that what they're bringing is not another white male mindset, but they're bringing their own diverse backgrounds. And to the extent that you can emphasize your differences, you're going to contribute to the corporation more or the entity more, because you shouldn't be saying, I can be like a white man who went to Harvard Business School and I'm just like the typical person who rises up in a private equity firm. You should want to say, I actually have some different perspectives, and those perspectives can be interesting to you and to our investors, our clients, and those are the ones I want to emphasize and not try to be like everybody else who's a white male.
We only have a couple minutes left here, and I'm wondering, of closing thoughts from both of you, if there's anything that you can challenge the rest of your industry to think differently about, what would it be?
I think the industry should be recognizing that it reflects society, and to the extent that Wall Street wants to have less regulation and have less people from Washington telling them what to do, they should be more attentive to the needs of society and to the diverse populations we have. It wasn't recognized that diversity was a wonderful thing 200 years ago. People weren't running around and saying, we want to have a diverse population in the Continental Congress. They were all white men. The Constitutional Convention, all white men. Just think about our Constitution would look like, and maybe the country would be much better if you had a diverse Constitutional Convention. I often wonder, if we had a new Constitutional Convention, who would be there, and would we have really diverse representation, and how much better would the Constitution be if we had more diversity? So I just think the country is evolving. Wall Street is evolving more slowly than the rest of the country, but I do think it's made real progress in the last 20 or 30 years compared to what I would have expected 20 or 30 years ago.
I would just pick up on that. We live in a really complex world that I would say that has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. Technology's changed. Kind of the geopolitical environment that we're living through right now, I think, is the perfect example of where being a corporate CEO is a harder job than it's ever been. And the notion of stakeholders that have a voice, and a very loud voice in the decisions companies make, has changed. which I think just requires that you need a diversity of thought and perspective and experience just to make those complicated decisions in a much clearer way. And I think it's an exciting moment, and I do think that there's an energy that's come out of the past 2 years to really try to finally hear those voices and reflect that in a powerful way.
Thank you both for such candid conversations, and thank you all for listening.